Welcome back to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. This is a show about how creatives use technology to tell their stories, and my guests today are producer, musician, and engineer Cian Riordan and mix engineer Matt Cerritos, who are the engineers behind the Dolby Atmos mixes of the 2024 album by St. Vincent, All Born Screaming. All Born Screaming is the seventh studio album by the artist Annie Clark, and the first album which she completely self-produced. Annie, of course, also known as St. Vincent, is recognized as one of the all-time great guitarists by Rolling Stone magazine. She's also a multi-Grammy award winner and one of the most creative people out there today, capable of such great work across many styles and genres. This is an album that has garnered recognition from both fans and industry, with 4 Grammy nominations, including for Best Alternative Music Album, Best Alternative Music Performance for the song Flee, Best Rock Performance, and Best Rock Song for the song Broken Man. And it's an album that explores the themes of life and death, that goes from dark to light, and it's an album filled with excellent songwriting, production, and mixing, and includes some amazingly dynamic moments. Cian was involved with this record from the start, and he shares some of the recording process, a bit on his take about the concept behind the records, and how he connected with mixer Matt Cerritos at Just for the Record studio in North Hollywood, where they also worked on the Atmos mixes together. The album was screened for fans at a listening session in Hollywood, and they share a bit about that experience and how they used Dolby Atmos to give the album a whole new dimension. Here's Cian Riordan and Matt Cerritos exploring the critically acclaimed and Grammy-nominated St. Vincent, All Born Screaming. All right, I'm happy to welcome Cian Riordan and Matt Cerritos. Great to see you guys, and thanks for taking a few minutes here with me.
Of course.
Well, congratulations on the record. What an amazing piece of work it is. Cian, you're a musician, you're a mix engineer and producer, and you've been working with Annie Clark, the musician known as St. Vincent, for several years, right? Going back to before her last album, 2021's Daddy's Home. But her new album, All Born Screaming, is a very different sounding record in a lot of ways. It's her first completely self-produced record. Of course, she's co-produced her previous records, but if you could share a little of your perspective on the origins of this record and how the two of you approached kind of putting the studio together that would sort of shape the sound.
Yeah. So I met Annie about 5 or 6 years ago working on a Sleater-Kinney record that she was producing. I became friends with Carrie of Sleater-Kinney, and she brought me into engineer. And through that process, I got to work a lot with Annie, and we really hit it off, both kind of musically and interpersonally and technically. And we just kind of had a similar sonic worldview. And so we kept working together after the Sleater-Kinney record, and I kind of got pulled into all things St. Vincent. And prior to Daddy's Home, it was, she had a home studio that she had outfitted a couple of years previously. And I kind of just dove into helping her with random projects. One was scoring a soundtrack for a movie that she was doing. The other was she was producing this other artist, Julia Stone. I helped her work on that. And then just a lot of kind of small stuff. She just had a lot of kind of irons in the fire. And then that kind of ran into the beginnings of Daddy's Home, her previous record. And that's where we got to really kind of dig into making St. Vincent stuff together. And so we kind of started that, and then the pandemic happened. And then she ended up finishing it in New York with Jack Antonoff. And then I had a chance to mix it, which was just kind of weird to be locked down and doing everything remotely. And that was kind of the start of that for everybody. And that record was super fun to work on. I'm really proud of it. I know it was a little polarizing with her fan base, but there was just a lot of cool experimentation and a lot of just cool, great songs. And I love that she's not afraid to just pivot and try different things. Whatever her interests of the day are is what you get on the records, and so then since that record, we kind of just kept working together. I think it was literally the day that Daddy's Come Home came out. I was like a text from her being like, time to start the next one, which is always fun. She's always been a co-producer on her records. She's recorded, since she was a teenager. So she has just a great grasp on, the fundamentals of recording and production, and really uses recording as a way to write songs. She can certainly do it, but her favorite way to write a song is not to just sit down with an acoustic guitar or a piano and just be like, here's my song. It's, I feel like she really leans on the production process to explore and and figure out how she's going to paint sonically. With that in mind, we did like a big kind of redesign overhaul of her home studio, which I was a big part of because I had just finished this studio. So I was in kind of studio building brain, and it was really fun because it was a lot of just conversations and just kind of thinking out loud of like what we were listening to, what she was listening to, what she felt inspired by, and like figuring out what equipment purchases would complement that, you know, and what would kind of like set her apart. Because, you know, with the advent of computer recording and DAWs, like everyone has everything. And, you know, there was this kind of real desire to kind of get away from that, like infinite possibilities, you know, indecision land, and into kind of more tactile, you know, hands-on tools to make records, be it drum machines, modular synths, analog consoles, a lot of analog outboard gear, you know, a lot of effects units, delay units, tape delays, like, you know, just stuff that you can literally get your hands on and paint with. So we set her up in the studio, and then we just kind of like, there'd be days where she just does stuff on her own and would just come up with all sorts of stuff. And then there'd be days where we'd be together, you know, typically for kind of bigger things like recording drums or horns, or if there was, you know, a couple players, you know, she felt more comfortable having me around. And then, you know, the mixing, kind of I should say the stereo mixing took probably the best part of a year, mostly because in that mixing process, there was still a lot of production happening. And it wasn't until we kind of got things into a mix state where we were able to kind of really, make decisions on what was going to make it into arrangements and whatnot. And then also kind of really be objective about it. Like we needed to hear everything in its final sonic form before we could be like, that's a take. And there were a lot of instances where things were mixed and things got resung, things got replaced, you know, drummers got changed out. It was a really fun process of just kind of chasing what felt right and not having the restrictions of a record label or A&Rs or managers. Like she just drove the ship and it was done when she said it was done. And we just kind of like delivered a record. It was a really, really cool process to be able to be involved with.
I love that. It's the creation with total freedom, right? And I mean, she's such an amazing musician and multi-instrumentalist and songwriter and producer in her own right that it really shines, I think, on this record in so many different ways. I mean, touch a little bit on the concept and the theme of the record, All Born Screaming, which we all are. Annie's actually said, if you're born screaming, that's a great sign because it means you're breathing, you're alive. And then it's also a protest. Like we're all born in protest in a certain way. It's terrifying to be alive. It's ecstatic to be alive. It's everything. There's definitely an arc in this record and a theme.
Yeah, I mean you know, I'll let her speak to the real themes. I think she's a big proponent of kind of like once she's put out the record, kind of letting the listener kind of get their own interpretations and stuff like that. She's not too like hung up on her lyrics or her themes. But that being said, the record, the genesis, like the first, you know, batch of songs that were worked on were all just kind of like heavy and dark. And you know, I don't want to say like industrial, but we were listening to a lot of Nine Inch Nails and referencing a lot of that stuff. And we really wanted to kind of like shake the listener a little bit. You know, both in the songwriting production, but also in the sonics and kind of taking some obtuse approaches to the production and the mixing. And I think as we kind of went through that journey, it was interesting because ideas and songs bubbled up that were kind of a nice complement to that. And I think in the context of the record, there's really like a side A and a side B. And the side A is kind of like the life is hard, life is hell. And the side B is kind of like, okay, that's a given. How do we deal with it? How do we act? How do we respond to that? So it created kind of a nice arc thematically for the record and also sonically. You know, it starts out kind of very rigid and I'm sick of using the word dark, but like it starts out just kind of macabre, you know, and then once you kind of get into side B, it starts to just like the clouds start to part a little bit, and musically and thematically, you start to hear that as well. And the experimentation kind of opens up and things get a little more playful. So it's fun when the sonics kind of match the lyrical themes of the record.
Yeah, and it's really diverse sonically and really loud. I want to ask you about that in a second, but touching just again on kind of the recording and the production process. The production is so stellar. It's dynamic and there's unique chord changes and a lot of contributions from artists like Dave Grohl, Kate LeBon, Josh Freese. When you're mixing something like that and going into trying to maximize that in a dynamic sense, what's your approach to kind of laying out those tracks once you kind of sit down and see what you've got?
Typically in a mix situation, you're kind of getting something that's being handed to you by an artist or a team, and everything's signed off, and mixing these days has evolved into kind of more of this finishing role where, the producers are really kind of heavy handed in the sonics and the mixing. And as a mixing engineer, you've got to be kind of very deferential to whatever rough mix or whatever people have been listening to. And that's just the way it's evolved. 10, 20 years ago, mixing was kind of more of a faders down. You're bringing things up and really, painting. And so this was kind of a combination of both where, we had talked about, obviously we had recorded a lot of stuff together, but a lot of stuff would be stuff that she would do around. She would go to Justin Meldal Johnson's house or go to New York and would be flying vocals into me. But we both had had so many conversations about what we were trying to achieve sonically with this, that then it was kind of my job to field, all of these different performances and takes and make them kind of fit into this world that we're trying to create. And she gave me a lot of runway to, to get my own sonic jollies off on this. Like I have my thoughts on contemporary record production and how, when given like an amazing musical brain, like Annie's and an amazing songwriter, like, okay, how do I mold her music into something that I find sonically exciting and interesting to listen to? And so dynamics were a big part of that. She had told me early on that she wanted the record to be kind of competitively loud. She wanted it to just be like in your face, no holds barred. And so that was kind of like, we knew what our upper ceiling was, right? So obviously there's moments on the record, like in Broken Man in the end, or like the switch over in Reckless, where, I mean, it's, you look at a Lufs meter and it is just like, it's pinned, right? But that's very intentional, and it kind of gives this like dramatic intensity that I don't think you would get if you weren't kind of really pushing things to the limit there. And then we kind of worked our way back. Again, Broken Man's a great example where it's like, it starts out kind of like mysterious and quiet and still kind of grooving, and then there's a lot of room in that song to be able to kind of like have those guitars jump out or have the drums really speak, and kind of catch the listener off guard a little bit. We wanted it to be like a listen, like an intentional listen, not just like some wallpaper on a coffee shop,
Yeah, it really turned out nicely. So Matt, you're a mix engineer based at Just for the Record, a beautiful Dolby Atmos studio in North Hollywood. Can you share a little bit about your setup there and then get into your process for sitting down with Cian and approaching the Dolby Atmos mixes for this record?
Yeah. So Just for the Record, we have a beautiful 914 room, PMCs on the front wall, and then the PMC CI65s are in the wall, so you can't see them. So it's really just like, half the time some people walk in, they're just like, I thought this was going to be Atmos, and then it's like, oh no, it is. It's just, a little bit more hidden, which I really enjoy, because then when I'm moving stuff around, I'm not thinking about speaker placement, I'm thinking about sonic placement, which I think has been like really nice in the success of like a lot of the records that I've gotten to work on, and even bringing other clients in. Like I think they can have more fun rather than, trying to be too technical about it. Part of the approach that we have here is that, like, you know, because Cian kind of mentioned a couple of times about like painting, like that's kind of how, even though this is a very like in the box thing that we're doing, a lot of the plugins that I go to that I have ready to go, like I try and set it up so that someone can sit down and just like start to paint in this format, because it can be a little daunting at first, you know, if you're just starting from scratch and not ever touched an object before. And then, yeah, I mean, Cian and I, we got hooked up. I think this kind of started with Moritz, the studio owner. They were having a conversation over pizza, I think. And then the ball started rolling. And then Cian had sent me, he had told me that the two things he had, the loudness thing, he had kind of told me from right from the top. He was like, this is going to be this is a loud record. I was like, I'm here for it. And then he sent me the album to listen to and start wrapping my head around it. And I was just like, yeah, there's a lot of different things we can do with this that it's like, it's going to be really exciting to pull off. And so, yeah, it was really cool to like, again, like Cian, this was his first time getting into an Atmos mix. So what was nice was that I was able to just kind of give him my knowledge, and then he was able to sort of like deduce from that his own moves, and then we sort of, to me, it sort of turned into like a really nice back and forth of just like, let's try this, let's try that, let's break out this stem. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to make this album in the format for Atmos.
Yeah, Matt was a great collaborator, because one, I'd never, you know, I had my head wrapped around Atmos, but it never kind of really went in deep on mixing a full record. And, you know, I was kind of, wouldn't say exhausted by the end of this record, but we'd spent a long time on it. And so, you know, going in, my goal was, you know, being extremely happy with the stereo mixes. I didn't want Atmos to be something that was drastically different. I still wanted to kind of have it play the same tricks on the listener, you know, still kind of hit people the same way. And, you know, with Atmos, it's a little bit more difficult because, you know, you can't really rely on having a heavy-handed mix bus. You know, loudness all has to be kind of perceived because, you know, the headroom requirements for the Atmos format, you know, so it's just a different way of wrapping your head around it. And Matt, you know, just from doing this day in, day out, like he kind of knew, like how to approach a lot of these concepts that we were bringing creatively. And he really helped, technically, to execute that. And, so it was a really fun process. He was a great kind of teacher and also very amenable to my, you know, there'd be details that I'd want to dig into. And, it was a really cool process.
I think that's the fun thing is that it's again, it kind of even back to that earlier sentiment that Cian had said about Annie, like, you know, we have access to everything. And like in Atmos, we kind of also theoretically have access to like the whole space, but in reality, like the song sort of tells you what should happen almost within the format. And I think because the stereo mixes and the process, it was so detailed leading up to it. I think it just translated really well because it's almost like we knew exactly what choices need to be made, but like it was what creative path can we get there to make it happen at the same time.
I think one of the exciting ways that I noticed that you really kind of used dynamics and made creative decisions, starting kind of at the beginning of the record, like with Hell is Near and Reckless and kind of up even until Violent Times, is that it kind of seems to start very focused, like kind of in the left and right, and then sort of explodes and opens up with placement and like movement in the heights. So you kind of start in a very focused way, and then that dynamic range is sort of maximized by the height channels and it really opening up and becoming wide. And I think that really translated well to the space available in Atmos for kind of making those surprise moments happen and kind of giving it that boost.
I mean, I will say that was when I listened to the record from top to bottom, the stereo version, I was just like, oh, cool, we can really tell a story with the Atmos version. You know, there's a lot of times when people come in, they're just like, put it here, call it a day, move on. But because the record in itself was just like a really good story, you know, of dynamics and panning placement, and you know, it's just like it was definitely very well thought out and very intentional. And so, yeah, it was just really fun to mess around with placement in that aspect.
And then on a track like Violent Times, it actually starts really open and really big and just like comes out of the gate that way. And that one I thought was an interesting kind of centerpiece of the record. It almost sort of sounds like a track reminiscent of what was being done on Daddy's Home. It kind of has like a little bit of that feeling to it. So I thought that was a nice centerpiece of the record. Then it sort of heads off into a lighter direction, but certainly no less dynamic.
It's fun. And, when you're making records, you're just using analogies and language to try and describe music, and one of the things that when we were working on Violent Times, even pre-Atmos, was like, we want it to be cinematic. A lot of people have kind of called out that it's very reminiscent of like a Bond song, a Bond theme. And so like what better medium than to actually like have the cinematic tools at your disposal to make it sound grand and larger than life. And that's one of the songs that really turned out well, I think.
I think so. And Cian, I'm curious, did you have any like aha moments mixing the record together with Matt and Dolby Atmos, or things that were more revealing in Atmos that you maybe hadn't noticed, or textures that felt a little bit different in Atmos? Because I think that, her approach to production, and certainly the production team and the musicians, it's very texture based. There's a lot of different textures happening in this record and a lot of room for those to kind of have character and have space. And I think it really comes through. I'm curious if you kind of had any moments or noticed anything kind of differently approaching it in Atmos than in stereo.
What was interesting was like there was a lot of attention in stereo to try and kind of get this idea of like, we want it to be over here, we want it to be above you, we want it to be kind of floating around the back of your head. And obviously in stereo, you're just kind of limited with, phase trickery and panning and, and so what was great, like the aha moment in Atmos, is once you kind of realize that you really can put things where you want them to be, that was really, really interesting to kind of take things that were kind of fibbed and put in that space, and to like actually put them in that space was a really cool kind of breakthrough. A lot of the background vocals and a lot of kind of the fun textural synths and stuff like that. And, what was really, really useful was Matt, because it would be very easy to just go wild and to just have this crazy panning situation, right? Where I feel like you don't want to lose sight of what's important. And Matt was great at kind of like just advising, is like, you're better off keeping this kind of up front. It's going to lose XYZ if we do this, but like these things will be really conducive to that. And he just has the experience doing it and knows what translates, knows what doesn't. So that was really useful to kind of have that, instead of me just like by myself being like, oh, here we go, and kind of beating my head against the wall trying to get it to translate, because like, there weren't really a ton of revisions. Once we kind of like got a mix in Atmos done, we would kind of both go and listen in headphones or do whatever kind of QC. And it was always just really small adjustments, which is really nice. It wasn't like this laborious process of trying to get it right.
The other side of that coin too was that like there was sort of like for me, there's always like a keep it simple, stupid sort of like mentality. And there were a couple times where I was just like, oh, like we could do this reverb. And then I think Cian, he kind of made this sort of like spring reverb that was a little bit saturated, and it worked so much better. And it was just like a 2-channel object thing. And it was just like, oh, okay, like I don't need to use this surround sound reverb to do this right now. Like here's just like simple thing. It works. It's like the perfect thing, instead of like going to the 714 giant reverb situation, and I think that was kind of like back to sort of like the collaborative part and the play back and forth between him and I, was that like it was like I had some things, he had some things, and then we just sort of experimented within the space to figure out how to. I mean, like I said, there's a few things that we did on that record now that I do in my Atmos mixes that like I didn't think about doing beforehand. So
I think it's a really, really tastefully done mix, and obviously you're working from such amazing assets to begin with. I think it really comes across quite well. Let's talk a little bit about the fan experience. You debuted the album in Dolby Atmos at a listening event at Dolby Screening Room in Los Angeles just a few weeks ago. Cian, describe your experience hearing the album in its entirety in the dark with a whole room full of fans.
Yeah, I have to say I was a little like nervous going into it. I'm proud of the record and just so confident in Annie's ability to like connect with fans. But it was just like the thought of like making people sit down for 40 minutes and just listen to a record and not do anything else. It sounds awesome to me because that's how I would like to like take in a record. You know, we're so like overloaded, sensory overloaded all the time that it's hard to kind of just like focus and pay attention. And this is a record where there's just a lot to grab onto. So I kind of went in being nervous, and I kind of like at the end of it, it was really cool to just like all of this room full of people just sitting there in silence, just taking this in. So it's kind of a fun, special experience on the advent of releasing the album. So I really enjoyed it. Plus, it was just like, when else do you get to sit in like a punishingly loud theater and just fucking rock? That was really cool. Like you couldn't whisper to your neighbor. It was so loud. It was really cool.
And it seemed like everyone in that building enjoyed that punishment as well. I think it was all good from all attendees that I heard and saw. Matt, you've been in that room a couple of times, but I'm sure it's different each time, with different records. Having mixed it in Atmos and heard the translation into the room, how was your experience on that evening?
I mean, there was a couple things. One of the first things was that because our room at Just for the Record is not a theater, right? It's not I got there a little early to listen with the team just to like make sure we were happy with it before everybody showed up. And I was just like, oh wow, like our little room can really like translate to a theater really nicely. And so once that happened, like once we did that preliminary listen to see if we wanted to turn it up or change the tuning slightly, like I was just like, okay, this is going to be great. Like I have no worry about someone coming to sit down and listen to this for 40 minutes. Like, because I already knew how good it was at that point, like through all the listening that Cian and I had done across the whole process. I knew that once people sat down, unless they really had to use the restroom, they're not going to get up,
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened. And then like the people that came up to us at the end, like they were just so like, blown away by, I think, the record itself, but then also listening to it in that way. Like Cian was saying, like you're sitting down and like having to listen to that 41:57 seconds. Is that the correct time?
It's a palindrome. 41:14, I think.
No, 41:14. Yeah. So, I mean, it was just like, it allowed the record to take another life while still being like a very cohesive piece of art at the same time.
A little bit of a tangent, but Atmos as a format it's really three different formats, right? And it's kind of, Atmos for theater and Atmos for speakers. And then there's like the Atmos binaural. And then now you have like Apple spatial algorithms that are kind of taking it and doing it their own thing. And you're trying to kind of thread, the needle through all of those formats. But arguably the best, most exciting version of that is like an Atmos theater. And it's just a treat to experience music in that, because it's not like you don't just get to go in every day and rent out a movie theater and listen to your favorite records and their great Atmos mixes. So it's just special in that, because it really is like, it's the high watermark of the format to be able to experience that.
Well, it was a fantastic experience. Well done to both of you, and congratulations on the record. It's available now on enabled streaming music services. And guys, just can't thank you enough for sitting down to share all of this with us. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you guys. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Matt.
No problem.
Many thanks to Cian and Matt for joining me to explore this amazing album, St. Vincent, All Born Screaming. You can listen to the album in Dolby Atmos on enabled streaming music services now. You can learn more about Annie Clark and St. Vincent at lovestvincent.com. You can learn more about Matt Cerritos and Just for the Record Studios at justfortherecord.com. To hear more conversations with mix and mastering engineers and producers working in Dolby Atmos, be sure you're subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about Dolby Creator Lab, head over to dolby.com/creatorlab. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can subscribe to our mailing list and access the entire library of studios in this podcast. Dolby Creator Lab is also where you'll find the Dolby Atmos Music Accelerator and the Dolby Atmos Essentials course covering all the topics you need to get started creating content in Dolby Atmos today. For other amazing Dolby Atmos resources for music creatives, check out the links in our show notes. Everything is completely free and available in multiple languages. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marakim. Thanks for joining.